welcome back to my channel. I am your host, G.I. Wingnut. We are continuing with Atlantis and Lemuria, written by Rudolph Steiner and originally published in 1911. So we find ourselves in the 10th and final chapter, the second or Hyborian race. In the last chapter of the Akashic studies are carried to that point of time at which man's soul is incarnated in the subtle matter of the fire mist. Yeah, we just covered that a couple of sentences ago. We must understand very clearly that man only assumed dense matter, and which he now regards as his own, at a later date, and then only very gradually. If we wish to form an idea of his bodily appearance at the stage of his development just depicted, we can best do so by thinking of it as water vapor or as a cloud floating in the air. But this representation is, of course, on which merely approaches the reality superficially, for the fiery cloud man is inwardly visualized and organized. Sounds like they're talking about elementals. Moving on. But in comparison to that which he becomes later, we must picture him at this stage as physically slumbering, as yet but dimly conscious. At all that we can, all that we can call intelligence, understanding, and reason are yet lacking in him. He moves about with a floating rather than pacing motion by means of four limb-like organs, forwards, backwards, sideways, and in all directions. But as regards the soul of this being, something has already been said. Sounds like they're talking about some Old Testament angels. Continuing. We must not think, however, that the movements or other expressions of life evinced by these beings were irrational or unregulated. On the contrary, they were perfectly regulated, and nothing happened without purpose and meaning, the only difference being that the guiding power or understanding was not within the beings themselves, or rather were they controlled by an intelligence outside themselves. Angels and demons, gods and devils, just thinking out loud. Back to the book. Higher beings, more fully developed than they, hovered around them as it were and guided them. For that is the all-important and fundamental quality of the fire mist, that beings at this stage of evolution could incarnate in it, while at the same time higher beings could also incorporate therein, and could thus be in full intercommunication with man. Man had developed his inclinations, instincts, and passions up to a point at which they could clothe themselves in the fire mist. But the other order of beings were here mentioned could, by the power of their reason, create within this fire mist by means of their intelligent activity. Is that anything like Heidi Baker calling down fire? Calling down the Holy Spirit as fire? More fire? Fire mist? Mantles? I think too much. Continuing. For these latter possessed still higher faculties by means of which they could reach up to higher regions. From these regions, their determinations and impulses emanated, but the actual effects of these determinations were apparent in the fire mist. All that was done on earth by man originated in the regulated intercourse of the human fire mist body with that of those higher beings. Traveling to heaven, maybe. Moving on. We can therefore say that man strove to climb upwards, and in the fire mist he was to evolve higher qualities, in a human sense, that he had possessed before. The other beings, however, strove downwards towards the material. Their course of evolution was to seek expression for their creative forces in ever denser and denser material forms. But in a wider sense, this is in no wise meant to a degradation for them. So that's where the artists come from. Gotcha. Continuing. We must come to a very clear understanding at this point. It requires higher power and capacity to control denser than rarer forms of matter. These higher beings, too, had a former period of their evolution, a power as limited to extent as that of man at the present time. And they, like man today, once had dominion over all that which took place within them. They had no control over the outer coarse matter. They now strove to reach a condition in which they should magically direct external things and were, therefore, at this period ahead of man in evolution. Again, I'm seeing Scientology pulling stuff from there. Back to it. Man reached upwards, striving first to embody the mind in finer substances so that it could afterwards direct its activity outwards. Wearing crystals and fine metals, maybe? Amulets? Moving on. He had already assimilated reason and now became possessed of magic power in order to permeate with reason the surrounding world. Thus, man advanced upward through the stage of the fire mist, while his companions pressed downwards through the same stage in order to increase their power. Ooh, greed, materialism, capitalism. Well, I could be wrong. What do I know? I grew up in a cult. Back at it. The forces which above all others were most, pardon me, the forces which above all others were most effective in the fire mist were those known to men as lower passions and impulses. Animal instinct, maybe? Man, as well as the higher beings, make use of these forces at the fire mist period described, and these forces, working at that stage within the human form, had the effect of developing organs which enabled the man to think, back to the brain, and thus to develop his personality. In the higher beings, however, these forces worked at the stage with which we are now dealing in such a manner that the beings mentioned could make use of them in order impersonally to bring about terrestrial conditions through their medium, creating Earth. By this means there arose on Earth, through these beings, forms which were themselves an image of the laws of reason. Thus, through the activity of the passional forces, there appeared in man the personal reasoning organs and around about him. By means of the same forces, organizations replete with intelligence were formed. Schools, mystical schools, maybe. And yeah, again, it seems like they're leaning into intelligent design, possibly genetic engineering, as is proposed by some conspiracy theories. Anyway, trying to get this wrapped up. Back to it. Let us now think of this process as a little further advanced, or rather, let us bring before us what we find registered in the Akashic records when we glance at a somewhat later period. The moon has separated from the earth. A great revolution has thereby been accomplished. Okay, so celestial events, connected to earthly events. There are stories from ancient cultures about a time on Earth before the moon existed. So I'm wondering if that's where that came from. I'm specifically thinking of the First Nations people of the desert Southwest in North America, specifically the United States. So, back to this. Man must live in this colder environment, and he can only do so by altering his own matter. And a change of form does hand in hand with this densification of substance. For the condition of fire mist on earth has itself given place to one which is entirely different. New revelations? Sound familiar? Moving on. The result of this is the higher beings spoke of no longer have the fire mist as a medium for their activity, nor can they consequently any longer exercise any influence over the expression of man's souls, or man's soul life, formerly their chief sphere of activity. But they have obtained power over the human form, which they themselves had before created from the fire mist. This change of activities goes hand in hand with the transformation of the human form. One half of the latter, with two motory organs, has been transformed into the lower half of the body, which has thus become mainly the vehicle of nutrition and generation. The other half is, as it were, directed upwards out of the two lower organs of motion, uh, out of the two other organs of motion grow rudimentary hands, and such organs as had once also served for nutrition and generation are remodeled into organs of speech and thought. Man stands upright. That is the immediate consequence of the moon's exit. Interesting, interesting. Continuing, and together with the moon, the terrestrial globe is derived of all those forces which, in the period of the fire mist, had enabled man to practice self fructification and to bring forth beings like himself without external influence. So, even in the esoteric teachings, they're not talking about a flat earth. Just wanted to throw that in there. Continuing. The lower half of his body, that which we often call his lower nature, is now subject to the formative influence, governed by reason, and of those higher beings. That which these beings had themselves been able to regulate before in man, while the volume of forces, henceforth withdrawn into the moon, were still united with the earth, must now be organized by them with the cooperation of the two sexes. This explains why the moon has been regarded by initiates as the symbol of generative forces. These forces clinging to it, as it were. The higher beings, described above, being akin to the moon, are in a certain sense moon gods. Before the separation of the moon, they worked by its force in man. Afterwards, their forces worked from outside to effect the propagation of man. We may also truly say that these exalted spiritual forces, which were formerly acted upon formerly acted upon man's still higher instincts through the medium of the fire mist, have now descended to unfold their powers in the realm of reproduction. That's why, okay, so that's why moon magic and sex magic are so closely linked within the pagan/occult community. That's quite interesting. I will have to again revisit the story of Jack Parson and L. Ron Hubbard, as well as Aleister Crowley and the Moonchild ritual. Back to this because we're getting close to the end of this story. In this, we have the expression of an important teaching of occult science, which says that the high and sublime godlike forces are akin to the, apparently, lower forces of human nature. The word apparently must here be understood in its full significance, for it would be a complete misconception of occult truths to regard the force of generation in itself as something ignoble. It is only then man misuses this force and compels it to serve his passions and desires that evil lurks in it, but not when he ennobles it by the thought that it contains divine and spiritual strength. The love of money is the root of all evil, I think is how the old adage goes. So, anyway, the dark side or the light side of the force, Luke? Back to this. Then will he place these forces at the service of the evolution of the earth and will carry out the plans of those higher beings by means of his own generative forces. To raise this entire domain and place it under divine laws, now to destroy it, is what occult science teaches us. The latter can be the only result of superficially understood occult principles, distorted into mistaken aesthetics. Oh, freaking wow. The Reawaken America tour, people? Oh my goodness. Moving right along. We see that man had developed in the upper half of his body something over which the higher beings we spoke of had no influence. Over this part, other beings now obtain authority. They are those who had indeed, at earlier stages of development, advanced beyond humanity, but had not yet risen so high as the moon gods. They could, so far, develop no power in the fire mist, but now that a later condition has appeared in which, through the fire mist, something in man's reasoning organs had attained development, something to which they themselves had approached earlier. Now their time has come. Greg Locke in his Handbook of Deliverance, talking about all these different demons and such with their dominion over various factors of life. That's what this reminds me of. Back at it. In the case of the moon gods, the stage at which reason worked and organized outwardly had arrived earlier. In them, this reason was present at the beginning of the fire mist epoch. They could act outwardly on terrestrial objects, but the beings just described had not at an earlier period attained the development of an outwardly active reason, and therefore the fire mist period found them unprepared. Now, however, reason is there. It is present in man, and they seize the human reason in order that they may work upon the things of earth through it. Just as formerly the moon gods had worked upon the whole man, these work now on this lower half only, whereas the influence of the lower beings spoke of is at work upon his lower half. Oh my, oh my. Thus, in man is subject to avoid a twofold guidance. In his lower nature, he is subject to the power of the moon gods, but in his evolved personality, he has come under the leadership of those beings called collectively by the name of their regent, Lucifer. For the Lucifer beings, for the Lucifer beings complete their own evolution by making use of the awakened forces of man's reason. Let me read that again for emphasis. For the Lucifer beings complete their own evolution by making use of the awakened forces of man's reason. Okay. Moving on. They could not attain this stage earlier, but they confer on man at the same time the disposition towards freedom, the tendency to distinguish good from evil. Under the sole guidance of the moon gods, the human reasoning organ is indeed formed, but these gods would have allowed the organ to slumber. They would have had no interest in using it for themselves. They had their own powers of reason. The Lucifer beings had an interest in developing human reason and guiding it to the objects of earth for their own sake. Mind control, anyone? And therefore they became for humanity the teachers of all that can be accomplished through man's own reason. The ascended masters, anyone? They could, however, be no more than instigators. The Maitreya, anyone? For they could not develop reason in themselves, but, as they have seen, they could only do so in man. There arose thus a twofold stream of activity on earth, the one arising from the direct influence of the moon deities, once regulated from the beginning by law and reason, for the moon gods, having already finished their time of apprenticeship, were now beyond the possibility of error. On the other hand, the Lucifer gods, who had intercourse with man, talking to man, had first of all to work their way to the light of such knowledge. Statue of Liberty, anyone? Become the enlightened ones, anyone? Embrace your inner light, anyone? Moving on. Under their guidance, man had to learn the laws of his nature. Under the guidance of Lucifer, he must himself become as, quote, a god among gods, end quote. What was that Ken Copeland quote? As I read, I said to myself, I am too. Is this where that little God thing comes from? Let's get this wrapped up. The question arises, if the Lucifer beings had not progressed in their own evolution to the point of intelligent creation in the fire mist, where did they fall behind? Up to what stage in the Earth's evolution were they able to cooperate with the moon gods? The Akashic records show us that they were able to take part in earthly creation up to the period at which the sun separated from the earth. We are shown that up to this time they performed what, it is true, was work of a somewhat inferior nature to that of the moon gods, but nevertheless they belonged to the band of divine creators. The Elohim, perhaps. After the separation of earth and sun, an activity, the work in the fire mist, began on the former, for which the moon deities, but not the Lucifer spirits, were prepared. For these, a period of inactivity and waiting then began. Now, when the universal fire mist had rolled away, and the human beings began to work on the formation of their own intellectual organs, the Lucifer spirits could again emerge from their period of rest, for the creation of reason is correlated with solar activity, and the dawn of intelligence in human nature is the rise of the inner sun. Oh, interesting. I'm going to have to do something about that as well. The inner sun. Finishing this out. This is affirmed not merely figuratively, but in an absolutely real sense. These beings found thus an opportunity of resuming their activity within the human being in conjunction with the sun when the fire mist epoch had passed away from the earth. From this, it is easy to see that the origin of the name Lucifer, that is, light bearer, and to understand why these beings are characterized in occult science as sun gods. With a footnote here, the readings from the Akashic records described the first beings of our earth and its inhabitants are to be found in an outline of occult science, the most important of Dr. Steiner's works, which has so far appeared in the 5th chapter entitled The Evolution of the World and Man. The reader will there find the present studies of the Akashic records carried back to the origin of what we find in the worlds today. So I'm curious now. I'm kind of wanting to take a look at Dr. Steiner's work, The Evolution of the World and Man, and maybe do a comparison of that with L. Ron Hubbard's The History of Man. That might be an interesting compare and contrast to do, just simply because I've already kind of read through Hubbard's The History of Man, and it's quite bizarre. I wouldn't mind doing a complete readout of it. Anyway, so that concludes Atlantis and Lemuria by Rudolph Steiner, originally published in 1911. If you made it all the way through, you're a hungry mind, and I appreciate that. If you like what I presented, and you haven't yet, please subscribe, and a thumbs up will help the algorithm. And by all means, share this playlist with anybody you think might benefit from it. Until the next project, I hope you stay healthy. And remember, genuine mental health matters. And scrutinize the sources that you may consider. Everybody wants to